So, the past trauma of blacks. I got more Rhetoric coming right up. For y'all, and the past trauma of blacks is an example of historical crime against black people, crying about nonsense from the past that's absolutely irrelevant to today, that has absolutely no impact upon us today. But black people often look at the problems that exist amongst blacks today and try to blame those issues on the past. They talk about generational trauma. They still feel that we still feel the effects of the trauma of the past. You got all of this trauma that was handed down to us because of what happened to blacks in America, 100 years ago, and so on and so forth, slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, all this stuff that blacks felt, and we're still feeling the trauma of all these things today. Now, here's the problem. The problem with that narrative, that mindset, which is incorrect, is that it's no different than the legacy of slavery nonsense. How are the issues that we have today linked to the past? How are these conditions linked to all these issues of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and so on and so forth? All the lynchings of the past. Well, first and foremost, what are these issues? We have to identify the issues first. Like, what issues that exist today that really you say are major issues for black people? You're talking like high crime rates, high out of wedlock birth rates, broken homes, broken families, poor economic performance, and economic inequities, economic inequities between blacks and whites. These are some of the issues that we could point to. Now, if you look at these issues and you try to link them to the past, there is no link to the past. Like, for instance, broken homes, broken families. Well, we didn't have that problem. And again, I always say until after the turbulent 60s. You look at the out of wedlock birth rates among black people prior to that, and you look at them today, there's no link to anything. The link is to the black families started to downgrade after the turbulent 60s. So it's not linked to anything prior to that, right? Then you have the high crime rates. Once again, if you look at the crime rates amongst black people, at one point in time, the crime rates amongst black people were on par with that of white folks. Again, after the turbulent 60s, and we see that the crime rates amongst black, after we see the deterioration of the black family, we see that also the increase in crime rates, because we had more and more single parent households without fathers, which means less discipline and more children acting up with behavior problems. So once again, not linked to the past. The high crime rates among black people have absolutely nothing to do with no trauma of the past, right? The high crime rates of today has no link whatsoever with no past trauma. Then we have the poor educational performance of a lot of these inner city schools today. Again, that just simply didn't exist prior to the destruction of the black family. And I believe that these schools, many of these underperforming schools, are underperforming because, again, we have single parent households, children being raised without fathers, no discipline, and we have a mentality that I call the ghetto mentality, which is actually born out of that. We're raising a bunch of children to be with the ghetto mentalities, and these ghetto mentalities, they're going to schools and they're tearing down the schools. So I really believe that the issue in the inner city schools has more to do with the mentality of the children and the mentality that's being instilled in these children than anything revolving supposedly underfunding schools. BS. There's no evidence that the inner city schools are underfunded, nor have I heard anybody give me a figure of how much it actually takes to educate children, and that black schools are falling under that. They're just assuming and making up stuff, throwing stuff on the fly. And then we have the income inequalities. Now, I always say, Thomas Sowell said that, quoted the stat that, cited the stat that from 1940 to to 1960, we saw a 40-point drop in poverty amongst black people. So, like I said, it went from in 1940, 87% of blacks were in poverty. By 1940, 47% of blacks were in poverty. So you're telling me that the income we saw, the gap between blacks and white people was closing in that 20, just in a 20-year period. Then all of a sudden, the turbulent 60s hit. We see the destruction of the black family, and that gap, that increase that we saw black people, basically tailed off and stopped happening. Not because of quote unquote white supremacy and structure this and all these different forms of racism, structural, kinetic, institutional racism, all this other foolishness. No, because of the destruction of the black family, because of the turbulent 60s that all rest at the lap of black females. So you tell them, okay, so what about the past equals a gap? Equals this trauma. So how is the gap between black and white people today a result of any trauma from the past? There is no evidence of it. So they just make up nonsense. Once again, and I always say this, and I'm going to keep saying it, it was the turbulent 60s, and black females, ran behind third wave feminism to be sexually liberated. And as a result of this, we lost shame in the black community, in America in general. And now the black women started doing what they wanted to do. They started chasing after the Pookies and Ray Rays of that time. Well, they started becoming single mothers, and more of these women, because like I said, normally they would have had to take care of that child, and there wouldn't have been no provisions from anyone. Well, the government came in with the Great Society, and now these women had the free pass to just do what they wanted to do. The more children they had, the more resources they got. That was a recipe for disaster. But that has nothing to do with no trauma from the past. That's insane. So now, with that being said though, if we really truly believe that there was this trauma from the past, wouldn't common sense say to stop handing it down though? Right? Wouldn't somebody say, well, let's identify what this trauma is and where it exactly did it come from, and how exactly, most importantly, how exactly is it being passed down, and will we stop passing them down? Because I know we have the saying, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But if I had to choose between my children not knowing history, or knowing all of this history, and then it's causing them to be so traumatic that they can't function in society, or them not knowing history and being able to function, I would prefer them not knowing the history to not know the history. But the fact is, there's no trauma from the past. That's all insane BS. And what this is just black folks finding yet another way to cry racism, to be victims, and to not take personal responsibility in what we as black people do. Okay? There's no black people today that's being impacted by slavery. There's no black person today impacted by segregation or Jim Crow, or no quote unquote stolen land or taking wealth. BS. None of that is impacting black people today. So if you ever hear one of these race hustlers crying about some past trauma, it's a bunch of nonsense. There is absolutely no link to any behavior, any ills of black people today or the black society today that has anything to do with nothing for the past, nothing from the past, nothing linked to any issue of blacks from the past. That's all a lie. It's all a lie to not take any personal responsibility. Anyway, y'all, as always, until next time.